nearly 70% of people in cults during the 60s to 80s were women. 70%.
That's
so a huge majority.
Significant.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the disturbing fact here is that research published in the Psychiatric Quarterly found that women in cults were 2 times more likely than men to experience psychological manipulation and coercive control. 2 times more likely. Welcome to the Scaries, brought to you by Racer Co. I'm Sky.
And I'm Talitha. We are proudly broadcasting from Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis. In each episode, we tackle the alarming, inconceivable, questionable, shocking, and scary statistics relating to, impacting, and intervening with the lives of women and girls worldwide.
You'll hear the scary truth, take away tools and tips, and learn about what you can do about it. The Scaries is an opportunity to raise awareness, share resources, and use our voices as women and supporters of women to make real change. We'd like to note, as always, the views expressed on this podcast are solely our own and for entertainment purposes only, and we may be sharing content that could be triggering to you, so listen with caution.
As straight, cisgender, white, able-bodied settler women, we are very aware of the privilege that we have, and we want to use this platform to spread awareness about the scary reality that women from around the world face in different life situations.
Why?
Because sometimes nothing is scarier than being a woman.
Welcome, listeners, and all of you to another episode of The Scaries. Today, we're stepping into the dark, twisted world. That's so fascinating.
So fascinating.
Of cults.
Yeah.
From the 60s through the 90s when they were extremely rampant everywhere.
Yes.
You've all probably heard, there's so many documentaries popping up about it everywhere, about some of the big cults, Jonestown, the Manson family, Heaven's Gate, Children of God. Like, there's so many.
Oh, there's so many.
But what many don't know is how deeply these cults impacted women specifically, drawing them in, using them, and sometimes destroying them, many times destroying them. It's a story of allure, manipulation, and fear. And spoiler alert, it's not just a thing of the past, like I said. That's right. From the late 1960s to the early 90s, cults were booming in the U.S. and beyond. Some experts estimate that at least 3,000 cults were active during that period. Pulling in
so many,
right? 3,000 different ones.
Yeah.
Pulling in thousands of people with women often at the center. So today, we'll explore what it was that drew so many women in, and then we'll dig into how these cults kept them trapped, even when things were starting to turn super dark. And we're not just stopping there. I feel like cults are almost like gangs.
They are.
Right? Like you have to once you're in, and
it's hard to get out.
Die to get out.
Yeah,
very much so. So we're not just stopping there. We're diving into the specifics of some of the most notorious cults from that time, cults led by men like Charles Manson and Jim Jones, whose names became infamous. We'll also talk about the devastating impact, the crimes, and how these so-called families left scars on the women involved. And for a chilling twist, we'll also take a look at some modern day trends like the trad wife movement and how certain online communities could be leading us into a whole new kind of cult-like territory.
It's just good times all around. So before we dive deeper into the stories of specific cults, let's back up a second and talk about what it actually means to have a group be called a cult. It's one of those words we hear tossed around all the time, like things are culty and like this is such a cult. But what does it really mean? So experts often define a cult as a group or movement with a set shared of beliefs or ideology that uses manipulative tactics to control its members. And there's usually a charismatic leader at the top who claims to have some unique insight or divine authority. This leader is often treated almost like a deity, someone who can't be questioned. Cults typically have several defining characteristics, often abbreviated as BITE. So that includes behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. These elements form what's known as coercive persuasion, a method that keeps members loyal and obedient by restricting their thoughts, feelings, and actions, and like access to information and all that kind of stuff.
Interesting. Very interesting. And oftentimes I think the lines get crossed with religion, right? And a lot of cults base themselves on religion and well-known religions.
Definitely, yeah.
And twist those religions to be whatever they're very legalistic, coercive, manipulative.
Yeah.
So just note that we're not bashing religion in this episode. Believe what you want to believe. But just be aware of the difference between religion, organized religion, and things that are crossing the line of like manipulation and full-on legalistic control.
Yeah, if you feel like there's behavioral control,
Yes.
information control, thought control, emotional control, might be a cult, maybe not a religion.
Yeah, maybe just ask some questions.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that cults often target people who are going through vulnerable moments, times when they're searching for something, feeling disconnected, or in need of a community. Once a cult senses that vulnerability, they step in and offer what seems like a solution, a family, a purpose, or spiritual awakening.
Definitely. That's a big reason why women actually were so drawn to cults, specifically in the 60s and 70s. Many were navigating a world that was rapidly changing, and these groups offered them a place to belong, sometimes promising enlightenment or even salvation. But as we'll see, those promises often came with a dark price. So to sum it up, a cult is typically defined by its manipulation and control over members, often through a combination of emotional appeals, isolation from the outside world, and the leadership of a single, often narcissistic figure. And while there are other definitions, obviously, these traits appear in almost every case, from the Manson family to Jonestown to Heaven's Gate to Children of God to list goes on and on and on.
Right. So now, why were these populars, or why were cults so popular in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s? Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's start with the big question. Why? Well, that's always a question. Well, the simple answer, people were looking for something during this time. This was at a time we had decades of massive change, civil rights movements, political scandals, the Cold War, and economic uncertainty. Sounds kind of familiar to what we're going through right now.
I was going to say, I think there's going to be a lot of cults popping up.
Yeah, let's just be real. And they probably already are. They just aren't known as cults.
Yeah, they're a little bit more secretive.
Yeah.
And women in particular were facing a lot of societal pressure, as I mentioned. So the 60s and 70s brought new freedoms, which is great, but also a sense of being caught between the old world of traditional roles and a new world of independence. Some women wanted an escape. Some wanted a sense of purpose or community, and cults offered that.
A lot of these cults promised answers, community, and often a charismatic leader who seemed to understand their struggles. Many women joined these groups looking for meaning, for family, and for someone to say, hey, I see you.
Yeah.
But that promise came with a dark underbelly. Many women who joined were subjected to psychological manipulation, isolation, key red flag there, and in some cases, outright abuse, another huge red flag.
Yeah.
The story isn't pretty, but it's one that we need to tell. We need that awareness so that we can take action, right?
Yeah. So we're going to go through just touch on a couple of, I guess a few of the cults that had kind of leading headlines during that time. As we mentioned at the beginning, there was over 3,000 at that time.
Too many to count.
So we're not going to go through all of them, but some of the bigger ones that we have already kind of briefly talked about and look at why it was so prevalent for women specifically to be targeted. So let's start with one of the most infamous cults, the Manson family. Led by Charles Manson, the family, quote unquote, was responsible for a series of murders that shocked the world in the late 60s, including the brutal murder of actress Sharon Tate. The thing about Manson is that he knew how to prey on vulnerability. He recruited young women, often those who had a tough family background or were running from something. He used their search for love and belonging against them. He was charismatic and presented himself almost as a father figure.
Interesting. Sounds vaguely familiar with some other men of the day that I know. Interestingly enough, though, when researching this episode, I found a statement from one of his followers, Susan Atkins, who later said in interviews that she felt like she had finally found a place where she belonged. She was young, looking for acceptance, and Manson offered that, but at a horrific cost. Once he gained control, he manipulated them into carrying out violent acts, including murder.
Like, that's the crazy part about it is like no one who actually loves you is going to make you convince you to commit murder.
Yes.
And it's really heartbreaking to think about how many young women specifically fell under his spell. Again, he was like charismatic and good looking, I guess. And Manson's methods were really a classic example of that coercive persuasion that I mentioned, which is making people feel loved and accepted, then slowly twisting their morals until they're willing to do anything to please that leader. It's terrifying, and what makes Manson's family such a textbook cult.
Next, we have Jonestown, also known as the People's Temple, led by Jim Jones.
That's creepy.
This cult, they're all so creepy,
Yeah.
ended with a tragic mass suicide of over 900 people in 1978, more than half of which were women. Jones was cunning in his approach. He offered community purpose and what he called racial and social equality. Women were drawn into his message of hope, especially those who felt marginalized and had endured hardship. He created this illusion of utopian society. But as we know, it was far from utopia. Women in Jonestown were often faced with psychological abuse and were isolated from their families. Some were even forced into relationships with Jones himself. Another red flag. If you're seeing sexual coercion and any of that, red flag, run for the hills. A classic method used by cult leaders to exert control. And when things started to spiral, many felt there was no way out.
There's so many interesting like full length series and podcasts and shows and stuff. Obviously, we're not going to get as deep into it as those ones are. But there was one that I listened to about Jonestown specifically, and it was like he had like all of the, I'll say, good intentions. Like he was like, like everybody matters, and like everybody should be seen, and like we're living in a fascist place, and so like we need to make sure that like there's equity and like all of these things. So like I would say like coming from a good place, but like obviously deranged and like,
or is that just a manipulation technique to get people in and then
exactly
twist? Yeah,
especially during I think a time again when it was like civil rights movements and like all of these things, that there was not a lot of equity, specifically in the States where Jones comes from, and then like moving into, they went to like South America to end up where this all happened. Anyways, so one survivor, Laura Johnson Cole, recalls the despair that she felt leading up to the fateful day of the mass suicide. She described the slow realization that Jonestown wasn't the safe haven that she thought it was. For many women there, it became a prison, and sadly, few were actually able to escape before the mass completion of suicide.
And the horror of Jonestown isn't just in the deaths, but in how Jones systematically broke down the wills of these women, many of whom felt that they had no choice but to follow him until the end.
Ugh. Last, we're going to talk about the Children of God.
This one gives me the EBGBs. Mainly so because there's so many kids involved.
Yes.
In this.
So this Children of God was later rebranded as the Family International. I feel like when like a religious group, like I'll say religious because that's what they think they are, needs to like rebrand themselves, that also might be a little bit of a red flag.
Yeah, exactly.
So this group was founded in the late 60s by David Berg, and it quickly became infamous for its exploitation of women and young girls. This one is particularly disturbing, as Sky mentioned. Berg used what he called flirty fishing to recruit new members, encouraging women in the cult to use sex to attract people to the group. He manipulated biblical language to justify this, twisting religious texts to serve his agenda. The psychological toll on women was immense. It insurmountable. You can't even calculate it. Some were born into the cult and never knew life outside of it. Many former members have come forward with stories of abuse, exploitation, and trauma. One former member, Christina Babin, described growing up with constant fear, forced to live by rules that violated her dignity and her autonomy. The thing is, Berg had created a self-sustaining cycle of abuse. He manipulated the women to believe that they were doing God's work. The children, particularly young girls, were often victims of abuse as well, which only added to the cult's horror.
And I remember watching the documentary. There's many on this one, but like he has so many kids, this David Berg, whoever he is. And the kids, like they had their own textbooks and full on school of like indoctrination from birth about what you had to do. Like that's like the generational impact and effect of this. And how long was this one on for? Like it went for a long time, like decades. It must
enough for people to be born into it
and then like get out of it as adults. Like it's just wild.
Yeah, it's really wild.
And so when we move into the 80s and 90s, we see two more cults that left their mark, the Branch Davidians and Heaven's Gate. Both operated very differently, but both held onto the promise of salvation, which attracted many young women searching for meaning out of a way of this material world that we live in. The Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh, also a well-known name, another David, is that the other guy's name? Is David too? Were known for their strict authoritarian rules. Koresh held control over his followers by convincing them that he was a prophet, even taking spiritual wives, some of whom were shockingly young. His control over the women was chilling.
It's gross.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Koresh isolated his followers and created a us versus them mentality, convincing women and people that they were chosen and that anyone outside their group was an enemy. I feel like this isolation piece is a huge differentiator of how you can differentiate like religion from cults.
Yeah, like when you're
in one way,
encouraged to,
right?
like,
You're encouraged to cut off everyone in your life, and you're only supposed to associate with these people and no one else, and everyone else is doing it wrong and can't be trusted and is, you know, not going to be saved. That is a problem.
Yeah.
So be aware of that. Many young women became loyal to Koresh, even as he manipulated and exploited them, believing that they were fulfilling a divine purpose. So yeah, look at these on Netflix or Amazon Prime, and you'll be flooded with documentaries. And then there's Heaven's Gate. This is a cult led by Marshall Applewhite. Applewhite convinced his followers that they could be saved by aliens and had to leave their physical bodies behind. In 1997, the cult ended with another mass suicide, and many of the members, including women, went willingly to their deaths, believing they would find salvation.
I just feel like, I mean, this is a very sweeping statement, but maybe we just don't trust the men's who are telling us to do things.
I think you have to be like, you always question motives.
Always.
Why?
Yeah.
Why? Like, ask why. And this is our number one like piece of advice. Yeah. Always ask why. Why am I doing this? And if me doing this is going to hurt others, potentially hurt myself, probably not a good idea.
No. And if you can ask that like why question like 5 times, like be a toddler, is like we like to say.
Yeah.
Just keep asking why. And if they can't answer it, or their answers don't actually come with any sort of like sound anything, maybe it's a red flag. Yeah. So now that we've walked through some of the most notorious cults, we're just going to take a step back, because the real question here is why? Why were so many women drawn to these groups? What was it about this time period specifically and these cults that made women in particular so vulnerable to their influence?
Good question. The question is the answer. It's actually a complex mix of social, psychological, and cultural factors. Okay. So the 60s through the 90s were decades of massive change, like we said, especially for women. This was a time specifically, though, when traditional gender roles were being questioned, and not everyone had a clear path forward. So women were like, oh, I can be more than a housewife. I can do more than have kids. What? How, where, what does that look like? Because they didn't really have anyone ahead of them to understand the see it to be it kind of mentality, right?
Totally, yeah.
So many young women and women in general, cults offered a sense of purpose, belonging, and sometimes even adventure from mainstream society that society didn't provide yet.
And I guess you get like a taste of like, you know, you grow up and you're a stay-at-home mom and you don't have a job and like you can't aspire to have anything other than like providing for family. And then you get this taste of like what it could be. And so then I would imagine that you're like, well, I want more. Like I want to go do
different
other
purpose,
things.
right?
Yeah.
Beyond caring for others and your like, you know, your family. Yeah. That's a great thing. And, you know, that's very fulfilling for many, but some women need more than that. And that's okay.
Yeah.
But it can lead us into dark spaces.
Totally. Well. Yeah. And the research definitely supports this. A study published by the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that women were significantly more likely to join groups that promised emotional support, community, or spiritual fulfillment, particularly if they were navigating personal or social transitions. During these decades, many women were either entering or re-entering the workforce, pursuing higher education, or trying to balance family with personal ambition, all things that could create a desire for guidance or structure. And for those who were looking for that structure, cults offered what looked like the answers. Take the concept of the spiritual awakening or personal growth. the things that we still hear to this day, which were heavily marketed by groups like the People's Temple and Children of God. These weren't just random ideas. They tapped directly into women's desires for a sense of meaning or direction, something more fulfilling than traditional roles or societal expectations.
So let's bring in some hard data, as we always like to do. Of course, we gave you a history lesson, but let's get into the stats now to underscore just how serious these dangers were and still are for women. So here's a quick stat that's pretty shocking. According to research from Dr. Yanya Lalich, an expert on cult dynamics, nearly 70% of people in cults during the 60s to 80s were women. 70%.
That's
so a huge majority.
Significant.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the disturbing fact here is that research published in the Psychiatric Quarterly found that women in cults were 2 times more likely than men to experience psychological manipulation and coercive control. 2 times more likely. For many women, these groups were used very specific tactics like love bombing, a technique where members showered new recruits with attention and affection to make them feel welcome and valued. Interesting. It's incredibly effective, especially for those who are feeling isolated or unfulfilled and looking for that belonging, right?
Yeah. Love bombing is actually exactly how groups like the Manson family and the Children of God brought women in.
Or flirty fishing.
Flirty fishing, disgusting. And once they were inside, cults used guilt, isolation from family, and even sleep deprivation to maintain control. Studies have shown that these tactics can create something called cognitive dissonance, where members start to rationalize extreme beliefs or behaviors because they're being deprived of normal social cues. And this also just even shows up in domestic violence and interpersonal violence. Yeah.
It's another form of violence, right? It's like psychological violence, and it ends into all those other types of violences as well. There's also the economic factor. So women who joined cults often had fewer financial resources or were in low income situations, which made them even more dependent on the group. So they would promise to take care of them, right? That type of thing.
Yeah.
Cults like the People's Temple exploited this by promising financial stability, security. But once women were financially invested, it became harder to leave. It's estimated that 60% of female cult members had to give up personal assets to the group, leaving them with very little if they tried to escape. So you
get the buy-in. Yeah.
And it's actual monetary buy-in.
Yeah.
And for those who did manage to leave, the psychological toll was heavy. A longitudinal study published in the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation found that former female cult members were significantly more likely to experience PTSD, depression, and trust issues. Many reported that it took years, sometimes even decades, to rebuild their lives and regain a sense of normalcy.
So when we put all of this together, it becomes clear that cults didn't just offer women a sense of belonging or purpose. They also trapped them in cycles of dependency, trauma, and sometimes even financial ruin. The allure of community and meaning was real, but the cost was incredibly high. And that's the chilling part. These cults knew exactly how to appeal to the unique struggles and aspirations that women were experiencing. They promised empowerment, enlightenment, and even love. But what they delivered was something grosser, darker.
Yes.
The worst part. And on that eerie note, we wanted to shift gears and dive into something with some more modern parallels. Because while cults like Jonestown and the Manson family may be gone, hopefully, the tactics that they used are very much alive today.
Yeah, so we'd like to think that the cults are a thing of the past, but like we said, they're not, especially with all the online trends and all of that. So much manipulation online. Today, we're seeing the rise of movements like the trad wife phenomenon, where women are adopting extreme traditional values, sometimes to the point of isolating themselves from the world. Again, keyword isolation.
Yeah.
Yes. And while some may see it as a harmless or even personal choice, there are worrying signs of cult-like behavior. Some groups pressure women to reject their autonomy, convincing them that their only purpose is to serve a husband. Sounds eerily familiar of the things of the past.
Yeah.
And once again, the promise of community and purpose is used to reel them in. Another example is the rise of extreme religious groups on social media. Platforms like Instagram and TikTok make it easy for charismatic leaders to reach young, impressionable audiences. Some of these leaders adopt cult-like language, offering guidance while discouraging critical thinking or outside influences.
So that's even very much like Andrew Tate, for example. He's using social media in really radical ways to radicalize young men and encouraging them to isolate themselves from these people. And like, anyways, it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
And just to clarify to our listeners, we're not talking about MLMs or pyramid schemes today. That's a whole other episode that we've lined up. But these social media driven movements carry very similar risks. They use that same need for belonging and purpose to pull women in.
Exactly. And while it might seem innocent on the surface, the language, the control, the isolation, the community aspects are eerily reminiscent of cults of the past.
Mm-hmm.
It's a chilling reminder that the tactics have not changed, only the tools have. Think about that.
Yeah.
Cult tactics are still alive and well. They've just adapted. Whether it's through social media, influencers, or modern day movements, the themes of dependency, control, and manipulation are still very much alive and well.
So what have we learned? Cults aren't just relics. They evolve with the times, finding new ways to appeal to those looking for meaning, belonging, or even purpose. Women in particular seem to be at the heart of these movements, often driven by a desire for acceptance or spiritual fulfillment. And as we've heard, these cults promise the world, but leave a trail of trauma and tragedy.
I just got to say something.
Yeah.
So we talked about all these cults, and pretty much every single one of them has been like women are the center and make up most of them, but they're all primarily, from what we've heard, led by men.
Yeah.
So you also, let's question that. Like I think I heard one recent cult that had a woman, and she was like said she was the queen, and it was a whole thing.
Oh,
what was that one? It was like a one in our like in
I was
Saskatchewan.
going to say the Queen of Canada.
Yeah,
Isn't that
one.
Yeah.
But like very few are led by women.
Very
so
few.
Again, another question: like if a man is calling a bunch of women in to lead you, why?
Yeah. Why
are you equipped to lead me as a woman?
Yeah. What do you know about my life?
Yeah.
Why?
Let's just ask some questions.
The cost of belonging is really sometimes can be like a full person's life.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you care about me?
So our best defense is awareness. Like I said, you're asking the questions, you're becoming informed, knowing the facts, knowing the tactics, spotting the flags, the manipulation, and just honestly trusting your gut and your instincts. Because history has shown us that cults aren't going away. They're just getting better at hiding.
They are.
And stay curious, stay vigilant, and always stay a little bit scared.
Thank you for joining us today as we confronted the very, very terrifying but real life statistics impacting women and girls. Please rate, share, and subscribe wherever you are listening, and stay tuned for more ways to make a positive impact. Together, we can make the world a little less scary for women and girls.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram at RacerCo and Scaries.podcast, and on TikTok at RacerCo. Remember that change starts with awareness and action. Thank you for being part of the Scaries community and making this world a little less scary to exist as a woman.
Bye.